Thank you very much, Solange. And hello, everyone. As Solange said, my name is Sara Cooper, and I'm here with my colleague, Bey-Marrie Schmidt. Before we begin, it would be helpful for myself and Bey if we just had a little sense of all of your familiarity with qualitative research and or qualitative evidence synthesis. So maybe you could just type yes on your screen if you've ever carried out qualitative research before. Okay. And maybe you could also type yes if any of you have carried out or been involved in a qualitative evidence synthesis, or what some people call a systematic review of qualitative research. Okay, so I think there may be some people who are familiar with some of the topics we're talking about, but others who are quite new to this area. Okay, so just to provide a bit of an overview of what this presentation is going to be about. So we're going to begin by exploring what are the aims and objectives of qualitative evidence syntheses, which will provide a bit of context for then looking at some of the questions qualitative evidence syntheses explore, and then how these differ from those of effectiveness reviews. We'll then introduce an iterative process that can be used for developing and refining a question or questions for qualitative evidence synthesis. And finally, we'll introduce and do some practice exercises of using different question frameworks for qualitative evidence syntheses. Okay, so what are the broad aims of a qualitative evidence synthesis? Putting it very simply, qualitative evidence syntheses seek to describe the social world and understand people's underlying reasons, opinions, and motivations. And then they also seek to explain the social world by developing hypotheses, theories, or models. Then specifically within a Cochrane context, a qualitative evidence synthesis really wants to explore the meanings that people attach to phenomena, using people's experiences of conditions or of receiving interventions or delivering interventions to help explain, interpret, and apply the results of an intervention review. So a qualitative evidence synthesis within the context of Cochrane needs to be broadly linked to one or more Cochrane effectiveness review. And so in some way to kind of complement or supplement or help explain and interpret the findings of that review. So what can a well-conducted qualitative evidence synthesis achieve? So firstly, it can inform the development of a meaningful effectiveness review question. So for example, it can do this by contributing information on factors that may influence effectiveness. Or it can provide information on, for example, socio-cultural factors that may help inform decisions about the characteristics of people that should be included in the definition of the population for an effectiveness review. A well-conducted quest can also help identify groups for whom an intervention is more likely or less likely to work. And then in turn, this can contribute to decisions about potential subgroup analyses on qualitative review questions for effectiveness review. A good qualitative evidence synthesis can also contribute to the design and refinement of a future interventional program by identifying factors that may, for example, influence acceptability or feasibility or meaningfulness within a real-world setting. A well-conducted qualitative evidence can also identify outcomes considered important to relevant stakeholders, such as patients or carers or healthcare professionals, and which may therefore need to be included in the effectiveness review. It can also help identify secondary outcomes that can be useful for explaining potential effects of an intervention. And then a well-conducted qualitative evidence synthesis can also help explain the mechanisms by which an intervention might achieve its effect. It could potentially anticipate factors of importance for implementing or sustaining an intervention. And finally, it can provide insights into how an intervention may impact upon issues related to equity and human rights. So with bearing that in mind of what a good qualitative evidence synthesis can achieve, the question is, what types of questions do qualitative evidence syntheses ask? So the questions asked by these kind of reviews tend to be exploratory in nature and tend to focus on the kind of how and why of phenomena. So, for example, the kind of questions that a qualitative evidence synthesis might ask include: how do people experience an illness or health condition or care issue? What are the barriers and facilitators to accessing or delivering healthcare? It could ask: what impact do specific barriers and facilitators have on people, their experiences, and their behavior? Then a qualitative evidence synthesis might also ask a number of different kinds of questions related to the implementation of an intervention. So, for example, it might ask questions such as: why does an intervention work or not, for whom, and in what circumstances? It might ask what external factors facilitate or hinder successful implementation of a program or treatment. And it might ask: how might an intervention need to be adapted for large-scale rollout or sustainability? So, as is hopefully clear from these examples, qualitative evidence syntheses can explore a diverse range of questions related to meaningfulness, appropriateness, equity, affordability, but there is a tendency to assume that qualitative evidence syntheses focus solely on meanings and perceptions. Now, while these issues are important, and many qualitative evidence syntheses do ask questions about meanings and perceptions, these are not the only kinds of questions that can and should be addressed by a qualitative evidence synthesis. And we're really seeing this particularly in qualitative evidence syntheses that are being designed within the context of complex interventions. So here, qualitative evidence syntheses can really provide evidence for diverse questions beyond that which typically relate to meanings and perceptions and feasibility. So for those of you that are interested in the kinds of questions a qualitative evidence synthesis can ask in relation to complex interventions, Andrew Booth and colleagues have recently published a paper on this issue. The box I've included here in these slides comes from their paper, and as it illustrates their diverse range of questions that qualitative evidence syntheses can explore within the context of complex interventions. So, for example, questions like: how do the components work along and in combination to produce effects? How do they interact to produce outcomes? How and why does the implementation of the intervention vary across contexts? And there are many other questions that you can see in this box that really can be explored with requests in the context of a complex intervention. And again, to stress that many of these questions can really go beyond just a focus on meanings and perceptions. So now we have a bit of a sense of what the kind of questions a qualitative evidence explores. How do these questions differ from those of effectiveness reviews? So firstly, they're usually a lot more exploratory and holistic in nature. So they don't have the kind of tight focus on assessing the magnitudes or interactions of pre-specified concepts. So for example, how frequent is X, or what is the effect of A and B? So the questions for qualitative evidence synthesis are usually a lot more open and broad in nature. Then secondly, unlike effectiveness review questions, where the starting point is usually a fixed question, qualitative evidence syntheses may have either a fixed question to begin with, or have a more emerging kind of review question. So the exploratory nature of qualitative evidence synthesis questions means that one can develop a kind of initial review question that is very broad and provides a kind of general direction for the review, but then it can be refined further and modified as the review process unfolds. So yeah, it can be a very much emerging question that the final question looks very, very different to the initial question that was posed. The important thing to stress here is that, as with all review processes, one really needs to document the process of question formulation and how the question may shift and change and evolve as the review process happens. And then finally, a third difference between qualitative evidence synthesis and effectiveness review questions is that effectiveness reviews generally use the PICO framework, so the population, intervention, comparison and outcomes framework, to formulate and refine the review question. But with a qualitative evidence synthesis, although some authors still use the PICO framework, many feel that this framework isn't the best and most useful or appropriate framework for a qualitative evidence synthesis. And so many other question frameworks have recently been developed and are being used to formulate and refine questions for a qualitative evidence synthesis. So frameworks that are now called such as SPICE or SPIDER or Eclipse or Peacock or CHIP. And I'm going to talk about some of these frameworks later on in the presentation. So I'm just going to stop at this point just to check if there are any questions, if people have any comments that they would like to make. Please feel free to either type them or to say them out loud. Okay, so we will continue. So now that we have an idea of the kinds of questions qualitative evidence syntheses explore, the next issue is how do we go about developing and refining a question or multiple questions? And one way to think about this is to see it as a kind of iterative back and forth process involving various overlapping activities, including the activities of problem framing, developing a preliminary theoretical framework or logic model, identifying potential lines of inquiry, scoping the evidence base, and focusing and refining the questions. Now, most certainly not all of these activities will be useful or feasible or even necessary in all cases. So, for example, you may be formulating a question for qualitative evidence synthesis where you already have quite a good idea of what the issues are and what is known in the literature. Or you may be commissioned to do a qualitative evidence synthesis where the issues are predetermined by an external source. So in these cases, it might just be about focusing and refining your questions. But in other cases, you might have very little knowledge about what the issues are and need to go through quite an extensive process of formulating and then refining the questions. It's also very important to stress that these activities that I'm going to go through with you are often quite blurred and overlapping, and so it's somewhat misleading to conceptualize them as sort of distinct activities. But for the purpose of this webinar and for explaining the different aspects, I'm going to talk about them separately. So problem framing and making decisions about the broad scope of the review is often the first step in formulating a review question. And this is really about identifying and making sense of the issues that need addressing. So for example, it's about asking questions like, what is the health problem? Why is it a problem? For whom is it a problem? I think it's important to stress that the for whom this is an issue is often ignored, but it's actually a very important question to think about and critically reflect upon. There are always different perspectives to a problem. For example, policymakers might understand a problem in one way, healthcare providers may see it in a different way, and patients may understand it in a third way. And the particular perspective one takes or prioritizes will influence how your question is formulated and ultimately the direction of the review takes. So it is important right at the beginning when you're formulating your question to really ask for whom is something a problem and how are those people understanding the problem. Another important question to ask when framing the problem and making decisions about the broad scope of the review is to ask what are the situational circumstances that surround the problem. So this is really about developing an understanding of context. So that is, it's about contextualizing the problem or the issue and identifying the relevant economic, social or cultural, political, and so forth factors which may be influencing and in turn influence the issue at hand. And sort of exploring these issues and factors very early on will help shape decisions on the scope of the review and later considerations of generalizability. And then a final kind of question that is important to ask is how will a review help in relation to this problem? A review is not always the best or most efficient way of answering the problem. So it's really worth reflecting on how exactly a review will help. Then these different problem framing questions can be answered by consulting various sources. So for example, often reviews are commissioned by an organization or particular group. And so then it can be advisable or useful to discuss some of these issues with them and how they think about them. Expertise in the review team on the topic area is another very useful source of information for fleshing out the problem, its characteristics and the context. Scoping the evidence is then essential, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more detail, as this can really be thought of as a kind of its own activity in its own right, and is a crucial part of the process of question development. And then consulting with relevant stakeholders is also very important when developing your question. Here the review team really needs to decide which stakeholders to involve, how to involve them, and when to involve them in the question formulation process. A lot more could be said on this issue of stakeholder engagement, which I'm not going to go into here for this presentation. For those of you that are interested to know more about stakeholder engagement, including when it comes to question formulation, the Global Evidence Synthesis Initiative, or GESI, is currently running a webinar series focused entirely on this issue, which you can sign up for. So suffice to say here, it's very important to consult relevant and diverse stakeholders early and often and widely to sharpen your understanding of the scope and purpose of the review. And in this process, it's always important to critically reflect upon how the problem may be understood and framed by different stakeholders. Moving to the next activity, developing and refining preliminary theoretical frameworks or logic models is a particularly useful step in the review question formulation process. Again, a lot more can be said on these issues. Put very simply, theoretical frameworks tend to explain possible relationships between concepts in quite general or abstract terms. In contrast, logic models are often more specific and pragmatic illustrations of how the components of an intervention or program potentially work together in a specific population context. So a recent useful definition of a logic model proposed by Anderson and colleagues is that a logic model is a graphic description of a system and is designed to identify important elements and relationships within that system. Logic models promote systems thinking by illustrating the relationship of the parts to the whole and highlighting congruencies and inconsistencies. So both theoretical frameworks and logic models can be very useful for thinking through and conceptualizing the issues and the focus for the review questions. So more specifically, they can help one identify and better understand patient and contextual factors that may influence outcomes here. They can help identify and better understand underlying mechanisms and complexities of each intervention and how each intervention can lead to improved outcomes here. They can help clarify one's assumptions about relationships or connections between different issues, elements, and outcomes, and then also what is known and not known about these relationships. And finally, and which can be very useful, is logic models can help one separate out questions and think about potential sub-questions. So this is just one example of to get a feel of what a logic model might look like. It was developed by Unger and colleagues for their review on evidence-based healthcare e-learning to increase evidence-based healthcare competencies among healthcare professionals. And as you can see in this image, through this model, the authors really tried to unpack the different characteristics that are at play and the components related to the participants and related to the contextual factors, related to the interventions and their delivery, and also the different outcomes, and then try to explore how these different elements may interact. And they then use this model to think through what different questions need answering and also how to separate the different kinds of questions that potentially exist, and then to identify gaps in the evidence base on these different questions. So questions for qualitative evidence synthesis are usually based on one or more line of inquiry, which put very simply is the specific kind of lens or angle or focus, if you like, of the review. So once you have a bit of a better understanding of the problem and how the different components and outcomes interact by, for example, developing a preliminary logic model, you then need to decide what line or lines of inquiry you're going to focus on. And then also you need to decide what specific kind of questions you want to explore for that particular line or lines of inquiry. So lines of inquiry, as I said, the kind of real focus for the review, can include a number of different sorts of questions for qualitative evidence synthesis. These can include questions about meaningfulness or appropriateness, feasibility, equity, affordability, and implementation. And then there's a number of different kinds of questions one can ask for each of these particular lines of inquiry. So for example, you may decide that you're interested for your specific line of inquiry for the review to be about feasibility. So that is really, is the activity or intervention physically, culturally, or financially practical or possible within a given context? And then you need to decide the specific questions or question you want to ask in relation to feasibility. So there are a number of different questions. These could include what are the strengths or weaknesses of the intervention in this context? What are the opportunities or threats related to the intervention in this context? What are the barriers or facilitators to implementing the intervention? So those are the kind of questions you'd explore around feasibility. Alternatively, you may decide that your specific line of inquiry for the review is going to be about appropriateness. So that is, in what ways does an intervention or activity fit or not with the situation of the patient and or context in which it is delivered? And then again, you need to decide the specific question or questions you want to ask in relation to appropriateness. So these could include, and again, there are many of them, how do people perceive the effectiveness of the intervention? Are the desired outcomes the outcomes that are valued by those who are affected by the intervention? Are the desired outcomes consistent with people's priorities and or beliefs? And a number of other kinds of questions related to appropriateness here. Similarly and alternatively, you may decide that you really want to focus on questions about meaningfulness. So that is, does the intervention or activity relate to the personal experience, opinions, values, and so forth of patients or clients? And then again, there are all sorts of specific questions you could ask in relation to meaningfulness. So for example, what does it mean to have a condition? Or what does it mean to be someone with a specific condition? Or what is how is the problem experienced by a specific target group? So again, all sorts of questions related to meaningfulness that you need to then decide which you want to focus on. And then alternatively, you may decide your specific line of inquiry is about implementation, that is the process involved in delivering the intervention. Or alternatively, maybe you want to focus on equity and the ways in which the intervention potentially reduces differences in health among different social groups here. Unlike the other lines of inquiry, there are all sorts of questions that you can ask in relation to implementation and equity. Now, for any line of inquiry you may choose, the boundaries need to be pragmatically limited to what is already known. So when developing what line of inquiry you want to take and the specific questions you want to explore, in most cases, one needs to do a preliminary scoping of the evidence base. So the scoping process really seeks to determine the extent and the availability of relevant research and to get a kind of initial assessment of the depth and quality of that literature. And this is really important because you may have a very good idea for a question, but maybe the amount or the quality of the literature means asking it and asking it through a qualitative evidence synthesis really isn't feasible. The evidence scoping process also seeks to identify the topical focus of that literature. So what specific topics within a broader field, say for example nutrition or vaccination, are being studied, and then also the gaps within the specific topics. And then scoping the evidence base can also really give one insights into the disciplinary loci of that literature. And this is important because this often shapes the kinds of questions you're going to ask and whether a more summative or interpretive question would be appropriate, depending on the discipline that a lot of the research is coming from. And then the scoping process can also help with identifying theoretical and conceptual frameworks which are relevant to the topic and which can really be used then to help develop your own preliminary logic model that I was speaking about earlier. Okay, before we go on, just to check in with everyone, and if there are any questions or comments, please feel free to ask. Okay, so we've got a question from Jordan asking what was the organization mentioned that is running the webinars. So that was GESI, the Global Evidence Synthesis Initiative. We can provide a link when we upload the slides also. They are running a whole series specifically devoted to stakeholder engagement, not only in relation to question development, but throughout the process of developing and doing a systematic review. Okay, so moving on, next slide, sorry. There we go. So by this point in the process, you should have an understanding of what the problem is and a little bit of what is known about it. And you should have also by this point made some decisions about the boundaries for your line or lines of inquiry, which for your review you're going to focus on. So at this point, the questions can be formulated using a question framework. Now, many of you may or are probably very familiar with the PICO framework, which is used in systematic reviews. So that the PICO framework is really about defining the patient, population, or problem. It's about defining the intervention or exposure, the comparison or alternative to the intervention, and the outcomes. Now, this PICO framework is still being used by a lot of people when formulating and refining a qualitative evidence synthesis question. However, there are others who believe that this framework is not the best or most useful or helpful framework for qualitative evidence synthesis. And so, against this backdrop, many other question frameworks have been developed and are being used to formulate and refine questions for a qualitative evidence synthesis. There are multiple of these frameworks. This table was taken from a paper by Andrew Booth, which identifies and describes some of the qualitative evidence synthesis question frameworks. So as you can see, there are many. Now, just to say, there really is no hard and fast rules about which framework is the one you should use. Often it's about personal preference, so you might particularly like one framework or find it helpful or useful for thinking through and defining the question. Alternatively, some lines of inquiry might best be suited to certain frameworks. So I think the rule of thumb that I would suggest is to use the framework that you feel will be most helpful or useful or appropriate for thinking about and really honing in on your question. Now, two commonly used frameworks within qualitative evidence syntheses are what are called SPICE and SPIDER. So I'm going to go into these two with a little bit more detail. So the SPICE framework involves defining various aspects which include the setting. So that is where, in what context will your review focus? It involves defining the perspective. So whose views or view are you interested in? It involves defining the intervention or phenomenon of interest. So that is really, what are you interested in? What is the topic focus for your review? It then involves defining the comparison. So what else? Often in qualitative evidence synthesis, there isn't a comparison, or maybe somewhat implied. And then it's about defining the evaluation. So again, what kind of outcome are you interested in? What results are you going to focus on in the review? So I'd like to do a little worked example of SPICE. Here I'm going to give you the research question and ask if you can identify what the setting, the perspective, the phenomenon of interest, comparison, and evaluation is. So the research question for a particular qualitative evidence synthesis is, how do cancer patients feel about receiving art therapy when in hospital outpatient departments? Yeah. So if you have any sense of what the setting could be, so where is the focus for this review question? If any of you might know, maybe type it on this in the box. Okay, yes, so the setting, you're going to focus on hospital outpatient departments. Okay, that's great. What about the perspective? So whose view are you interested in with this research question? Yes, great. So yeah, you're interested in cancer, the views of cancer outpatients. Okay. Then the phenomenon of interest. So what is the topic that your review is going to focus on? What are you interested in? Yeah, so the phenomenon of interest is about receiving art therapy. What about the comparison? So what is being compared here? So the comparison can always be tricky, yes. The comparison can often be tricky in that with qualitative evidence syntheses, there's often, very, very often, not a comparison, or it's kind of implied. So a kind of, the comparison would be either none or not receiving therapy, so just receiving nothing within the hospital outpatient department. But unlike with effectiveness review, the comparison is often not a big feature of a qualitative evidence synthesis. And then finally, what is the evaluation? So what are we interested in here? Yes, so it's about feelings. Yes, so with qualitative evidence syntheses, it's often about feelings, views, perspectives, and that is what one is often interested in as one's evaluation. Okay, that's great. Well done, everyone. So now let's look at another tool that's frequently used, which is called SPIDER. It's very similar to SPICE, but has some slightly different criteria and elements that you need to define. The first criteria is the sample, so the group of people you're looking at here. Now with qualitative evidence syntheses, because smaller groups of participants tend to be used, and because qualitative research is not always easy to generalize, the term sample is preferred over population or patient. The next criteria is, again, like with SPICE, phenomenon of interest. So that's really what you're focusing on. We then have the design. So the design is really the form of qualitative research to be included in the review. And this can be broken down into the kind of overarching design of the studies. So for example, you're going to include ethnographies or phenomenological studies. It can then be broken down into smaller pieces, so the data collection methods. So for example, you might say you're only going to include studies that have focus groups or interviews or both. And then can be broken down into the data analysis methods. So you're going to, for example, include studies that used any kind of data analysis or maybe be more specific. So those that used a thematic analysis or a framework analysis or discourse analysis. And particularly with the design, stipulating these different elements can be particularly useful for the subsequent development of the search strategy, which can then often include these qualitative data analysis methods, search terms. And then there's also the evaluation, which like SPICE was the outcomes of interest. So for example, in qualitative evidence syntheses, these can often be attitudes, perceptions, experiences, barriers, facilitators, and so on. And then finally, there's the research type, which is really about whether you will include qualitative and also just qualitative studies, or you also include mixed method studies, so those that have both quantitative and qualitative data. So let's try a worked example of SPIDER. And again, I'm going to give you the research question and see if we can figure out what the different components are. For this review, which is actually one that I'm currently working on, the research question is what factors influence parents and caregivers' acceptance of routine childhood vaccination? And to also give some background information, when developing the focus of our review, we decided that we'll only include studies that report the reviews of parents and caregivers and not those of other relevant stakeholders. We also decided we would include all forms of qualitative research designs and methods for both data collection and analysis. And then we decided that because there's such a lot of studies on this topic, we're going to exclude mixed method studies. So in this example, what is our sample? What group of people are we interested in? Yes, so we're interested in the parents and informal caregivers. We look at what is our phenomenon of interest. So what is the topic we are focusing on? What are we interested in for this review? Okay, so we've got vaccination as a potential topic. We've got acceptance here. And all of these are correct, partially correct. I think what is very important with the qualitative evidence synthesis is to really hone in what is your particular interest. And here it is about acceptance, it's about routine childhood vaccination, but more specifically, it's about the factors that influence acceptance of routine childhood vaccination. So it's quite important to get a very specific, what are you actually interested in here? And then the design. So what forms of qualitative research designs are we going to include in this review? Yes, that's correct. So we decided we're going to include all forms of qualitative research designs, all forms of data analysis, and all forms of data collection. Okay, and the evaluation. So what are we interested in assessing here? Yes, so we've got acceptance here. So very specifically, we are interested in acceptance, but we're particularly interested in the influencing factors. Yes, factors that influence acceptance. And then finally, the research type. So what kind of research are we going to include here? So we're going to just include qualitative studies and not mixed method studies. Yes. Okay, so I hope that that's given everybody a little feel of Spice and Spider. For those of you that these are new tools, it's worth it if you're interested in using them. A bit of practice on worked examples can help us get a bit more familiar with these tools. Yeah. So in conclusion, some take-home messages that I'd like to give. Firstly, qualitative evidence syntheses can explore a diverse range of questions related to meaningfulness, appropriateness, equity, affordability, implementation, and so forth. And really, a lot of these questions can go beyond just a focus on meanings and perceptions. So I'd really encourage you to think creatively and out of the box when developing questions for a qualitative evidence synthesis. Then a second take-home message is that qualitative review questions can change and evolve throughout the review process. So really don't be afraid to allow your question to transform and change and adapt as the process unfolds. But just to always remember, it's important to document these changes and to critically reflect on them as a review team of how and why it's changing in the way that it is. Thirdly, the development and refinement of qualitative evidence synthesis questions is an iterative, creative, flexible, and potentially time-consuming process. It often takes a lot of time to revisit again and again the different activities I've described, and this can take time. So remember to factor that in when you are developing review. And then finally, various different question frameworks exist to refine and focus your question. And it's really about choosing the one that you feel is most helpful or useful when refining your question. Thank you all very much. I would just like to acknowledge the following presentations by Natalie Leon, Chris Colvin, and Karen Daniels, as well as this paper by Jane Harris and the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementations Methods Group. These sources contributed a lot to the content of this presentation. And then I've just included a slide here for those of you who are interested throughout the presentation. I included quite a few references. Here are the full references and also some further reading for those of you that want to know more about specific topics touched on today. So I hope that was useful. Thank you all very much. I don't know if there are questions, comments, anything people would like to add before we go.
So there was one question about the overlap of concepts for SPIDER. So there was one question about the overlap of concepts for SPIDER. The main question, I guess, was around the overlap between the phenomenon of interest and, for example, the evaluation, and then the design and the types of research. So it is true that there is some overlap with those. With the phenomenon of interest, I think we phrase it more broadly in terms of the factors, but also in terms of the content area that you're interested in. And then in terms of the evaluation, usually it's whether we're interested in barriers or facilitators or specific outcomes, or if it's related to a specific condition, for example. And then again, in terms of the design and the types of research. So in terms of the design, there the focus would be on the data analysis and the data collection. So how that was done. If it was for QESs, it would be that it would have to have used qualitative research methods. So, for example, in some qualitative evidence synthesis, one might include mixed method studies, but one would still have to assess whether qualitative data analysis and data collections were used in the qualitative component of that mixed method study. Whereas with regards to the types of the research, one is specifically looking at the actual studies. Is it a qualitative study? Is it qualitative studies only? Is it qualitative studies and mixed method studies, for example? I hope that clears that the difference in the overlaps for that. Are there any other questions?
Okay, so if there's no other questions, thank you very much, Bey and Sara, for this webinar, which was very informative. Thank you everyone who've attended. We will send a copy of the presentation and the link to the recorded webinar later on this week. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.